He died at 37. In those brief years, Raphael transformed Western art so completely that we still measure beauty against standards he set 5 centuries ago. How did a shy boy from a backwater Italian town become the most beloved painter in Europe? How did someone so young master an art form that had taken generations to develop? And why, when he died on his birthday in 1520, did cardinals weep and the Pope himself mourn? This isn't a story about genius appearing from nowhere. It's about calculated ambition, relentless work, and a man who understood something his rivals didn't. That understanding would make him rich beyond measure and immortal in ways even he couldn't predict. We start in Urbino, 1483. Not Florence, not Rome, a hilltop fortress city in the Marches, far from the centres of Renaissance power. The Duchy of Urbino was small, barely significant on the map of Italian politics, but its Duke, Federico da Montefeltro, had spent decades transforming his court into something unexpected. He'd built one of the finest libraries in Europe. He'd hired the best architects, the most learned scholars. The ducal palace rose above the town like a statement carved in stone. Refinement matters, beauty matters, art matters. Into this world came Raffaello Sanzio, born on April 6th. His father, Giovanni Santi, was a painter. Not a great one. Court records show he received commissions for altarpieces, for decorative work, for the kind of paintings that filled churches and palaces but didn't transform them. Giovanni was competent, connected, aware of his limitations. He wrote poetry too, mediocre verses about the great artists of the age. He knew who mattered. He knew he wasn't one of them. But he recognized something in his son. The boy drew constantly. While other children played in Urbino's steep streets, young Raffaello sat with charcoal and paper, copying his father's sketches, studying the frescoes in local churches. Giovanni taught him to grind pigments, to prepare panels, to understand how egg tempera behaved differently than oil. These weren't casual lessons. This was professional training, the systematic transfer of craft knowledge from master to apprentice. Then the losses began. Raffaello's mother, Magia Chiala, died when he was 8. The records are sparse. We don't know what killed her. We know the boy was suddenly without the woman who'd raised him, in a household that now felt colder, emptier. Giovanni remarried quickly, as men did then. Bernardina, the new wife, came with her own concerns. The dynamic shifted. 3 years later, Giovanni was gone too. Raffaello was 11 years old, technically an orphan, though his uncle Simone took responsibility for him. The boy had lost both parents before most children understand what death means. What does that do to someone? We can only guess from what happened next. The paintings stopped being a child's hobby. They became survival. But here's what's strange. Most accounts of Raphael's early life skip directly from his father's death to his arrival in Pietro Perugino's workshop. They treat those years as blank space, as if nothing happened, as if the boy simply waited until someone important noticed him. That's not how it worked. Simone Chiala, Raffaello's uncle, was a merchant, not an artist. He dealt in practical things, in money and contracts, and the daily business of staying afloat in a small city's economy. He looked at his 11-year-old nephew and saw a problem. The boy had some skill with paint, yes, but skill alone meant nothing without connections, without a path into the networks that actually mattered. Urbino itself offered limited options. The Duke's court employed artists, but those positions went to established masters. The local churches commissioned altarpieces, but not from children. If Raffaello was going to make something of his father's training, he needed to go somewhere bigger, somewhere the real work was happening. Perugino's workshop was in Perugia, about 60 miles away. Pietro Vannucci, called Perugino, was exactly what Giovanni Santi had never been. Successful, fashionable, running multiple commissions simultaneously across central Italy. He painted sweetly pretty Madonnas with gentle faces and soft landscapes. His style was becoming the standard for devotional paintings. Nobles wanted Peruginos, churches wanted Peruginos. He could barely keep up with demand. Somehow, Simone made the connection. Maybe through the networks of Urbino's court, maybe through merchant contacts. However it happened, young Raffaello found himself travelling to Perugia, probably around 1500, to join Perugino's bottega. The workshop system was brutal in its efficiency. You didn't enroll in an academy or take classes. You lived with the master, worked alongside other apprentices and journeymen, and learned by doing the least important parts of paintings until you proved you could handle more. Grind pigments, prepare panels, paint backgrounds, fill in drapery, copy the master's drawings until your hand moved like his. Raffaello absorbed everything. Within months, his paintings became indistinguishable from Perugino's own work. Not similar, indistinguishable. Art historians still argue about which panels in certain altarpieces are by the master and which by the teenage apprentice. The sweet faces, the tilted heads, the soft landscape backgrounds, the delicate fingers, all of it perfectly replicated. He'd learned not just technique but style, not just how to paint, but how to paint like Perugino. This is harder than it sounds. Style isn't just applying certain colours or compositions, it's internalizing someone else's aesthetic choices so completely that you make them automatically, without thinking. Most apprentices took years to approach this level. Raffaello did it almost immediately, but something else was happening too. Look closely at the paintings from this period, at the ones we're confident are his. The faces are sweeter than Perugino's. The compositions are more balanced. There's a harmony to them that goes beyond mere copying. The teenager was already editing, already improving, already finding ways to make the formula work better than the formula's inventor had managed. Perugino noticed. Of course he noticed. He was running a business and suddenly he had an apprentice who could produce work at nearly the master's level while costing a fraction of the price. The economics were obvious. Give the boy more responsibility. Let him handle entire figures, entire panels. The clients would never know the difference. Except they did know eventually, because the work kept getting better. The first painting we can confidently attribute entirely to Raffaello dates to around 1502 or 1503. He was 19, maybe 20. The altarpiece shows the coronation of the Virgin, and it shouldn't work. The composition is insanely ambitious for someone so young. Multiple figures arranged in two tiers, the apostles below looking up at Christ, crowning Mary above, everyone in perfect proportion, the perspective flawless, the colours singing against each other. It's the kind of painting a mature master produces after decades of practice. He did it as a teenager. Word spread. Not explosively, not overnight, but in the small world of Central Italian art, people started asking questions. Who painted that altarpiece in Città di Castello? Who's the young man in Perugino's workshop producing work that good? By 1504, Raffaello was receiving his own commissions, his own contracts, his own identity separate from his master's. The break was coming. It had to come. Perugino's style, for all its popularity, was becoming old-fashioned. The real innovations were happening elsewhere, in Florence, where Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti were locked in an unspoken competition that was redefining what painting and sculpture could do. Leonardo had returned to Florence in 1500 after years in Milan. He'd brought with him new techniques, new ideas about how to capture movement and emotion. His cartoon for the Virgin and Child with St. Anne caused a sensation. People lined up to see it, to study how he'd arranged the figures in a pyramid that felt both stable and dynamic, how the faces expressed actual psychological states rather than generic piety. Then came the commission that changed everything. In 1503, the Florentine government hired Leonardo to paint a massive battle scene in the Palazzo Vecchio's council chamber. The Battle of Anghiari would show Florentine forces defeating Milan, a celebration of military prowess and civic pride. Leonardo began planning a composition that would capture the chaos and violence of combat in ways no one had attempted before. Michelangelo, younger and hungry for recognition, was hired to paint the opposite wall. The Battle of Cassina would show another Florentine victory. The rivalry was immediate and intense. Florence's two greatest artists working in the same room, trying to outdo each other. Every painter in Italy wanted to see what they were doing, including Raffaello. He left Perugia for Florence in late 1504, arriving in a city electric with creative competition. He was 21 years old, talented but still working in an increasingly outdated style, coming to study with the masters who were inventing the future. He had no idea he was about to surpass them all. Florence in 1504 was everything Urbino wasn't. Dense, wealthy, chaotic, obsessed with art and politics in equal measure. The Republic had recently expelled the Medici family, ending decades of de facto rule by the banking dynasty. The new government was trying to establish legitimacy through grand public works and cultural patronage. Commission a Leonardo, commission a Michelangelo. Show the world that Florence was still the centre of Renaissance culture. Raffaello arrived with letters of introduction, probably from Urbino connections, possibly from Perugino himself. He needed access to the workshops, to the sites where Leonardo and Michelangelo were working on their battle scenes. He needed to see the cartoons, the full-scale drawings that preceded the actual paintings. What he saw changed everything he thought he knew about art. Leonardo's cartoon showed horses and men, tangled in combat, faces twisted with rage and fear, bodies in violent motion that somehow still composed into a coherent whole. The technique was unlike anything in Perugino's vocabulary. The sfumato, that soft blurring of edges that made forms seem to emerge from shadow. The psychological intensity of the expressions, the sense that you were witnessing an actual moment rather than a staged scene. Michelangelo's cartoon was different but equally revolutionary. It showed soldiers bathing in a river, suddenly called to battle, caught in the vulnerable moment of transition. The bodies were sculptural, muscular, demonstrating Michelangelo's obsessive study of anatomy. Every figure was a study in form and movement. It was painting that wanted to be sculpture. Raffaello filled sketchbooks. He copied Leonardo's compositions, studied how the older master grouped figures and created depth. He copied Michelangelo's nudes, working to understand the underlying anatomy that made those bodies so convincing. He wandered Florence's churches and palaces, studying frescoes by Masaccio and Fra Angelico, absorbing a century of Florentine painting in months of concentrated observation. And then he began synthesizing. This is what separated Raffaello from every other talented young painter studying in Florence. He didn't just copy, he analyzed, extracted principles and recombined them into something new. From Leonardo, he took the pyramidal composition and the psychological depth. From Michelangelo, he took the anatomical precision and the monumental figure style. From the Florentine tradition generally, he took the clear, rational space and the emphasis on disegno, on drawing as the foundation of everything. But he made it all more graceful, more harmonious, easier to look at. The Florentines were producing masterpieces of dramatic intensity. Raffaello produced masterpieces of perfect balance. His Madonnas from this period show the transformation completely. They're still recognizably related to Perugino's sweet devotional images, but they're more solid, more three-dimensional, more psychologically present. The Madonna of the Meadow, painted in 1506, shows the Virgin seated in a landscape with the infant Christ and the young John the Baptist. The composition is a pyramid, pure Leonardo, but the faces are softer than Leonardo's, the colours brighter, the whole scene more accessible. It's profound without being difficult. People loved it. That was the revelation. You could make great art that didn't require extensive knowledge to appreciate. You could combine the highest levels of skill with immediate emotional appeal. The sophisticates saw the technical mastery. Everyone else just saw a beautiful painting of the Madonna and Child. Commissions multiplied. Florentine merchants wanted portraits. Churches wanted altarpieces. Noble families wanted devotional panels. By 1507, Raffaello had more work than he could handle alone. He was 24 years old and already running his own workshop, hiring assistants, managing multiple projects simultaneously. He was also watching his time in Florence run out. Because the attention of the papal court had turned his way, and when the Pope wants you in Rome, you go to Rome. The summons came in late 1508. Pope Julius II wanted Raffaello in Rome, not for a small commission, not for a trial project, for something substantial. The letter was vague on details, but the implication was clear. This was the opportunity that defined careers. Raffaello was 25 years old. He had every reason to stay in Florence. The commissions were steady, the reputation secure, the city familiar. Rome was unknown territory, politically volatile, artistically competitive. Michelangelo was already there, working on something massive in the Sistine Chapel. The older master had no love for young rivals. But you don't refuse the Pope. He arrived in Rome in early 1509, and the city hit him like a physical force. Florence was elegant, refined, built to human scale. Rome was something else entirely. Ruins of the ancient empire thrust up through medieval streets. Massive basilicas squatted over pagan temples. Everywhere you looked, history piled on history, glory mixed with decay. The population had shrunk to maybe 50,000, a fraction of what it had been under the Caesars. But ambition hadn't shrunk at all. Julius II was determined to make Rome great again, not metaphorically, literally. He wanted the church to reclaim its temporal power, its artistic dominance, its position as the centre of Western civilization. He was tearing down the old St. Peter's Basilica, a building that had stood for over 1,000 years, to build something bigger. He was assembling the greatest artists in Italy to decorate his Vatican palace, and he was willing to spend the church's treasury to do it. Donato Bramante, the Pope's chief architect, had recommended Raffaello. They were distant relatives, both from Urbino, but Bramante didn't promote family out of sentiment. He recognized that Raffaello had a quality the other painters lacked. He could work fast, please patrons, and produce paintings that looked effortlessly perfect. No drama, no tantrums, no unfinished projects, just consistent excellence. The Pope gave Raffaello a test assignment: one room, the Stanza della Segnatura, a chamber in the papal apartments that would serve as Julius's private library. Paint the walls and ceiling. Show what you can do. 4 walls, 4 themes: theology, philosophy, poetry, and justice. The intellectual pillars of Christian civilization, all to be represented in fresco. It was a humanist program, typical of the high Renaissance obsession, with synthesizing classical learning and Christian faith. Paint the history of human wisdom. Make it beautiful. Make it coherent. Make it celebrate both Athens and Jerusalem. Other artists had already started decorating the Vatican apartments. Perugino himself was working in another room. Luca Signorelli, Piero della Francesca's greatest pupil, had completed frescoes nearby. These were masters, men in their 50s and 60s with established reputations. Raffaello was the new arrival, barely out of his apprenticeship by their standards. He started with the ceiling. 4 circular panels, each representing one of the themes through allegorical figures. Theology as a woman with putti holding the Gospels. Philosophy as a woman contemplating the heavens. Poetry crowned with laurel. Justice with her scales and sword. The designs were clear, the figures graceful, the colours luminous. It was good work, professional work, the kind of thing any competent painter might produce. Then he started on the walls and everything changed. The wall representing philosophy would become the School of Athens, though Raffaello didn't call it that. The title came later. He just thought of it as the painting of the philosophers. The commission was to show the triumph of reason, the classical tradition of philosophical inquiry that the Church had inherited and Christianized. Paint the great thinkers of antiquity, show them in dialogue, create a space where truth is pursued through rational discussion. What Raffaello painted was the Renaissance in a single image. The setting is an enormous architectural space, a barrel-vaulted hall that recedes into perfect linear perspective. The architecture is Roman but idealized, more perfect than any building that ever actually existed. It's inspired by Bramante's designs for the new saint, Peter's a vision of what Rome could become. At the center of the composition, framed by the distant arch, are two figures, Plato and Aristotle, the old philosopher and his greatest pupil, walking together, gesturing in conversation. Plato points upward, toward the heavens, toward the realm of ideal forms, toward transcendent truth. He's holding his Timaeus, the dialogue about the creation of the universe. Aristotle extends his hand downward toward the earth, toward the physical world, toward empirical observation. He's holding his ethics, the work about how to live in this world. It's the entire philosophical tradition in two gestures, the idealist and the empiricist, the metaphysical and the practical, both necessary, both valid, eternally in dialogue. Around them, spreading across the foreground in carefully arranged groups, are dozens of other figures. Every major school of ancient philosophy is represented. Pythagoras sits in the lower left, demonstrating his mathematical theories on a tablet. Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, broods alone in the immediate foreground, chin on hand. Diogenes, the cynic who rejected all social convention, sprawls on the steps in the centre. Euclid bends over geometric diagrams, surrounded by students. Ptolemy holds a celestial sphere. Zoroaster holds a terrestrial one. The composition is symphonic. Every figure is distinct, individualized, caught in a specific action or thought. Yet they all relate to each other, creating rhythms of gesture and glance that lead the eye through the space. Groups form and dissolve. Some figures engage in animated discussion. Others study alone. Some teach, some learn, some simply observe. It's a complete society of the mind, everyone participating in the collective human project of understanding reality. The technique is everything Raffaello had learned in Florence, perfected. The perspective is flawless, creating a space so convincing you could walk into it. The anatomy is solid, showing Michelangelo's influence without the excessive muscularity. The colour harmonies are subtle, avoiding the garish brightness that had characterised earlier Renaissance painting. The fresco seems to glow from within. But here's what made it revolutionary. Raffaello gave many of the philosophers the faces of contemporary artists. Plato has Leonardo's features, the long beard and knowing expression. Heraclitus, added later in a different painting session, is clearly Michelangelo, brooding and isolated even in this gathering of intellects. Bramante appears as Euclid, demonstrating his architectural knowledge. And in the far right corner, barely visible, looking directly out at the viewer, is a young man in a dark cap. Raffaello himself, witness to this assembly of greatness. It was audacious. Ancient philosophers with Renaissance faces, classical wisdom speaking through contemporary art. The past and present collapsed into a single, timeless moment, and it suggested something radical, that the artists of the present were equals to the philosophers of antiquity. That painting could be a form of philosophy, that images could think. The Pope saw it and was stunned. Julius II understood power, understood spectacle, understood the value of overwhelming displays of magnificence. This was all of that. But it was also genuinely intelligent, deeply learned, executed with a technical mastery that made it look effortless. He walked through the room, studying each figure, recognizing the references, understanding the program. Then he made a decision that changed Raffaello's life. The other artists were dismissed. Perugino, Signorelli, everyone who had been working in the Vatican apartments. Their completed frescoes were plastered over. Raffaello would paint the entire suite of rooms, all of them. However many years it took, however much it cost. The young man from Urbino was now the Pope's painter. The other walls followed over the next several years. Facing the School of Athens, the disputation of the Holy Sacrament showed the Church triumphant, the communion of saints in heaven, contemplating the Eucharist. Where philosophy celebrated reason, theology celebrated faith. The composition mirrored the School of Athens, but instead of an architectural setting, the space opened into heaven itself, with God the Father and Christ enthroned above, the Holy Spirit descending as a dove, and the saints arranged in a semicircle, like an eternal council. The Parnassus showed Apollo and the Muses surrounded by the great poets, both ancient and modern. Homer and Virgil stood beside Dante and Petrarch. Poetry was eternal, uniting all ages. The cardinal virtues showed justice, fortitude, and temperance as allegorical figures, with historical scenes below demonstrating law and order. Every wall connected to every other wall, creating a complete vision of Christian humanism. The work took years. Raffaello painted in fresco, the most demanding and unforgiving technique. You prepare the wall with fresh plaster, then paint while it's still wet. The paint bonds chemically with the plaster as it dries, becoming part of the wall itself. But you have only a few hours before the plaster sets. No corrections, no second chances. Everything must be planned perfectly in advance. Raffaello made hundreds of preparatory drawings. He studied every figure, every gesture, every fold of drapery. He made small sketches to work out the overall composition, then detailed studies of individual elements. He used live models, probably members of his growing workshop. He experimented with different poses, different arrangements, different ways of creating visual rhythms. By the time he climbed the scaffolding to actually paint, every decision had been made. The workshop expanded to keep pace with the commissions. Assistants prepared surfaces, transferred drawings to the walls, painted backgrounds, and architectural details. Raffaello himself handled the important figures, the faces, the hands, the moments that required the master's touch. It was an industrial operation, churning out masterpieces, and the commissions kept multiplying beyond the Vatican. Cardinals wanted portraits, churches wanted altarpieces, wealthy bankers wanted Madonnas for their private chapels. Raffaello painted them all, or at least supervised their production. His workshop became a machine for generating Raphaelesque paintings. Some he barely touched, just approving the design and correcting the most important passages. Others he painted entirely himself when the patron was important enough or the subject interested him. The portraits were particularly remarkable. Raffaello had learned from Leonardo how to reveal psychology through pose and expression. But where Leonardo's sitters often seemed remote, lost in thought, Raffaello's subjects connected with the viewer. They looked at you. They had presence. Pope Julius II sat for his portrait in 1511, near the end of his life. The old warrior pope, architect of the Vatican's magnificence, appeared exhausted, melancholy, his white beard stark against the red of his papal robes. He sits slumped in his chair, one hand gripping the armrest, the other resting in his lap. His eyes are downcast, unfocused, as if contemplating mortality. It's not a triumphant image. It's an old man, tired from decades of struggle, aware his time is ending. The honesty is startling. Baldassare Castiglione, the diplomat and author of The Book of the Courtier, sat for Raffaello around 1514. The portrait shows everything Castiglione wrote about in his famous book. The perfect courtier should be elegant but not ostentatious, learned but not pedantic, skilled but make it look effortless. Castiglione appears in dark, rich clothing, fur-lined, expensive but understated. His gaze is direct, intelligent, calm. His expression suggests both confidence and restraint. He's the embodiment of Renaissance grace. Castiglione treasured the painting for the rest of his life, carrying it with him on diplomatic missions, eventually bequeathing it to his children with instructions that it never be sold. Rome itself was transforming. The city that Raffaello had entered in 1509 was half medieval, half ruin. By the middle of the next decade, it was becoming something new. Bramante's architectural projects were reshaping the urban landscape. New palaces rose along the Tiber, churches were renovated in the modern style, artists and intellectuals poured in from across Italy, drawn by papal patronage and the sense that something extraordinary was happening. For a brief moment, Rome was the centre of the world again, not through military conquest but through art. Raffaello was at the centre of the centre. By 1514, he was overseeing architectural projects in addition to painting. When Bramante died that year, Raffaello was appointed architect of St. Peter's Basilica, the most important building project in Christendom. He was 31 years old and responsible for designing the church that would define Catholic architecture for centuries. The workload was crushing. The Vatican rooms continued. The portraits multiplied. The altarpieces demanded attention. Architectural drawings piled up. Private commissions from wealthy Romans couldn't be refused. Raffaello slept little, worked constantly, and somehow maintained the appearance of effortless grace that had made him famous. He was living exactly the life that Castiglione described in The Courtier. Make the difficult look easy. Never show strain. Always appear in control. But something was building beneath the surface. The pressure of constant production, the weight of so many expectations, the competition with Michelangelo, who was finishing the Sistine ceiling just down the hall. Success on this scale came with costs that weren't immediately visible. The system was breaking down, not visibly. To the outside world, Raffaello's workshop functioned with astonishing efficiency. Commissions arrived, paintings emerged, clients expressed satisfaction. The machinery hummed. But behind the polished surface, something fundamental was shifting in how Renaissance art got made. Raffaello couldn't paint everything himself anymore. It was physically impossible. The Vatican rooms alone would have consumed every waking hour for years. Add the portraits, the altarpieces, the architectural work, the private commissions, and you arrive at a mathematical problem with no solution. One man cannot produce what 50 patrons demand simultaneously. The workshop expanded. By 1515, Raffaello employed dozens of assistants. Some were talented painters in their own right. Giulio Romano, who joined around 1515, would become one of the most important artists of the next generation. Giovanni Francesco Pani was equally skilled. Others specialized in specific tasks: architectural backgrounds, drapery, landscape elements, preparatory drawings. The process evolved into something like a Renaissance assembly line. Raffaello would create the initial design, often just a quick sketch establishing composition and major figures. He'd refine key elements, usually the faces and hands, which required his personal touch. Then the design would pass to assistants who'd transfer it to the wall or panel, block in colours, work out details according to established formulas. At crucial stages, Raffaello would return. A few brushstrokes here, adjustments there, the final touches that made everything cohere. The signature style had to be maintained. Quality couldn't slip. But increasingly, a Raffaello meant a painting designed by Raffaello and executed by his team rather than painted entirely by his hand. This wasn't fraud. It was standard practice. Every major Renaissance workshop operated this way. Perugino had done it. Leonardo did it. Michelangelo, despite his reputation as a solitary genius, employed assistants for architectural projects and lesser paintings. The Renaissance concept of authorship differed from ours. The master's design, his conceptual vision, mattered more than whether he personally applied every brushstroke. But something was lost in the translation. Look at the late works from Raffaello's shop, and you can sometimes feel the difference. The technical execution remains flawless. The compositions are brilliant, yet occasionally there's a coldness, a mechanical perfection that lacks the warmth of his earlier paintings. The touch that made the Madonna della Seggiola so immediate, so alive, appears intermittently rather than consistently. The Transfiguration, commissioned in 1516, became the test case for this new method. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, who would later become Pope Clement VII, ordered 2 large altarpieces for the Cathedral of Narbonne in France. He commissioned one from Raffaello and another from Sebastiano del Piombo, Michelangelo's ally. It was deliberately staged as a competition. Raffaello chose the Transfiguration of Christ, the moment when Jesus ascends a mountain with 3 disciples and is transformed before their eyes, his face shining like the sun, his garments white as light. Below the mountain, the remaining disciples struggle to heal a possessed boy. It's a story of divine revelation and human inadequacy happening simultaneously. The composition is unlike anything Raffaello had painted before. The canvas splits dramatically into 2 zones. The upper half shows Christ rising into the air, flanked by Moses and Elijah, bathed in supernatural light. The 3 disciples shield their eyes from the radiance. Everything is ordered, geometric, celestial. The lower half is chaos. The possessed boy writhes in his father's arms. Disciples gesture helplessly. The crowd presses forward in desperation and confusion. The light is natural, harsh, revealing rather than transfiguring. It's humanity at its most frantic and powerless. Raffaello worked on this painting for the last 4 years of his life. He never finished it. The upper section, the Transfiguration itself, is clearly from his hand. The figures have that characteristic Raffaello grace. The composition achieves sublime balance. But the lower section, though dramatically effective, shows the harder edges of workshop production. The faces lack individual personality. The gestures, though theatrical, feel studied rather than spontaneous. Did Raffaello sense this? Did he know the painting wasn't achieving what he intended? We can't say. What we know is he kept working on it, kept revising, kept pushing his assistants to refine details, never declaring it complete. While the Transfiguration slowly progressed, other projects multiplied. In 1514, Pope Leo X appointed Raffaello superintendent of Roman antiquities. His job was to document and preserve the ancient ruins scattered throughout Rome and the surrounding countryside. It meant measuring, drawing, recording inscriptions, preventing further destruction of monuments that had survived 1,000 years. Raffaello took the responsibility seriously. He developed a systematic method for architectural drawing, creating the first accurate plans and elevations of major Roman buildings. He wrote a famous letter to Pope Leo, lamenting the destruction of ancient monuments and proposing measures for their protection. He was essentially inventing the field of archaeological preservation. The irony is brutal. While trying to save the architectural legacy of ancient Rome, he was simultaneously designing the new St. Peter's, which required demolishing the old basilica that Constantine had built in the 4th century. Preservation and destruction, past and future, locked in permanent tension. The architectural work consumed increasing amounts of time. After Bramante's death, the design of St. Peter's fell to Raffaello, who modified the older architect's plans. Bramante had envisioned a Greek cross, equal arms radiating from a central dome. Raffaello proposed extending one arm to create a Latin cross, providing more space for congregation. It was a practical solution that compromised the geometric purity Bramante had sought. He never built it. The project would drag on for another century, passing through multiple architects, each revising the previous design, until Michelangelo finally imposed his vision and Bernini added the facade. But Raffaello's contribution shaped the trajectory. Meanwhile, his personal life remained surprisingly opaque. Unlike Michelangelo, whose letters and poems reveal his inner struggles, or Leonardo, whose notebooks expose his restless mind, Raffaello left almost no personal writing. His letters deal with business, contracts, payments, arrangements for materials. The man himself stays hidden. We know he never married. Various sources mention romantic liaisons. Vasari claims he died from excessive lovemaking, though Vasari's biographical details are notoriously unreliable. What seems clear is that Raffaello maintained an appearance of propriety while avoiding permanent attachment. There's a famous story about La Fornarina, supposedly his great love. She appears in multiple paintings from the later years, always the same woman, dark-eyed, sensual, wearing expensive jewellery but often partially undressed. The tale goes that she was a baker's daughter, that Raffaello was obsessed with her, that he kept her nearby while working and couldn't paint without her presence. Like most romantic legends, this one probably contains fragments of truth wrapped in layers of embellishment. Someone modelled for those paintings. Whether she was Raffaello's lover or simply a professional model whose face he found useful, we don't know. The paintings exist, the relationship remains speculation. What's certain is that by 1519, Raffaello was exhausted. 6 years of running the largest artistic workshop in Rome, managing architectural projects, maintaining quality across dozens of simultaneous commissions, all while keeping up the social obligations expected of someone in his position. He was 36 years old and looked older. The workload showed no signs of decreasing. New commissions arrived faster than old ones could be completed. Pope Leo wanted more rooms decorated. Cardinals needed altarpieces. Wealthy bankers commissioned portraits. The demands were infinite. The hours in a day were not. Something had to break. In early 1520, it did. The illness came suddenly. Raffaello was working in the Vatican, supervising the ongoing decoration of the papal apartments, when he developed a fever. Nothing alarming initially. Fevers were common in Rome, especially in spring, when the Tiber flooded and left a stagnant water-breeding disease. He went home to rest. The fever worsened. Physicians were summoned. They diagnosed an imbalance of humours and prescribed bleeding, the standard treatment that probably killed more patients than it saved. Raffaello's condition deteriorated rapidly. Word spread through Rome that Raffaello Sanzio was dying. Friends gathered at his house. Assistants from the workshop came to pay respects. Cardinals sent messages. The Pope himself inquired about his condition. In his bedroom, Raffaello could see the Transfiguration. He'd had it brought to his house, still unfinished, so he could work on details between other obligations. Now it stood propped against the wall, the incomplete painting that had occupied him for 4 years. Christ ascending toward heaven while below, humanity struggled with forces it couldn't control. On April 6, 1520, Good Friday, Raffaello died. He was 37 years old. The exact cause remains disputed. The bleeding prescribed by his doctors certainly didn't help. Some modern scholars suggest malaria. Others point to exhaustion, overwork, the physical toll of maintaining impossible standards under crushing pressure. The funeral was extraordinary. Raffaello's body lay in state in his house, and the Transfiguration was displayed above the bier. Thousands came to pay respects. The contrast was stark and deliberately symbolic. The unfinished painting showing Christ's transcendence hung over the dead body of the artist who'd created it. Divine perfection and human mortality occupying the same space. He was buried in the Pantheon, the ancient Roman temple that had become a church. His tomb bears a Latin epitaph. Here lies Raffaello, by whom nature feared to be outdone while he lived, and when he died, feared that she herself would die. It's not false modesty or exaggeration. Raffaello had reached a level of accomplishment that seemed to exhaust the possibilities of painting. He'd synthesized everything that came before: Leonardo's subtlety, Michelangelo's power, Perugino's grace, and created something that appeared to be the final word. What could come after perfection? The workshop continued briefly under Giulio Romano's direction. The Transfiguration was finished by assistants and sent to Narbonne as originally commissioned. Other incomplete projects were wrapped up, contracts were fulfilled, then the enterprise dissolved. Without Raffaello at the centre, there was no centre to hold. His influence didn't dissolve. For the next 3 centuries, Raffaello defined what painting should be. The academies that trained artists across Europe used his works as supreme examples. Students copied his compositions, teachers analysed his techniques, critics measured every new painter against his standard. This created its own problems. By the 19th century, younger artists rebelled against what they called Raffaello's cold perfection. The pre-Raphaelites literally named themselves in opposition to him, seeking the supposedly more authentic art that existed before his influence became dominant. Modernists dismissed him as academic, conventional, everything they wanted to escape. But look at the paintings themselves, not the reputation built around them. Look at the School of Athens with its impossible architectural space containing the sum of human knowledge. Look at the Sistine Madonna with those knowing cherubs. Look at Julius II's melancholy face. Look at the Transfiguration's unresolved tension between heaven and earth. What you see is not cold perfection. What you see is someone trying to capture everything, to synthesize all possibilities, to create images so complete they'd need no successors. The tragedy is that he succeeded well enough to make everyone who came after feel they were working in his shadow, and that he died believing he'd failed because the Transfiguration remained unfinished, and the vision in his mind exceeded what his hands could produce. The question becomes, what do we actually see in Raffaello's work when we strip away centuries of interpretation and academic reverence? What did he achieve that made him simultaneously the summit and the prison of Western art? Start with the faces. Every previous painter had struggled with a fundamental problem. How do you show what someone is thinking? Medieval artists painted symbols. A halo meant holiness. A specific gesture meant a specific virtue. The face itself was generic, interchangeable. Even the early Renaissance masters who began individualizing their figures often created expressions that looked posed, theatrical, unconvincing. Raffaello solved this. His faces think. In the School of Athens, Plato doesn't just point upward because the composition requires it. You can see him considering abstract forms, weighing arguments in his mind. Aristotle gestures toward the earth with the certainty of someone who has tested theories against evidence. Heraclitus, modelled on Michelangelo, broods with genuine melancholy. These aren't masks, they're windows. The technique itself is almost invisible. There are no obvious brushstrokes, no dramatic chiaroscuro calling attention to the artist's virtuosity. The transitions from light to shadow are so gradual you can't identify where one ends and the other begins. This smoothness, which later critics would mistake for coldness, is actually the result of intense observation. Raffaello understood that in nature, edges are soft. Light doesn't cut. It wraps around forms, revealing them gradually. Then there's the space. Before Raffaello, perspective was often a trick, a mathematical game. Artists showed off by painting tiled floors, receding to perfect vanishing points. Impressive, but hollow. Raffaello made architectural space feel inhabited. The School of Athens doesn't just demonstrate one-point perspective. It creates a building you believe could exist, where philosophers naturally gather because the space itself invites contemplation. The architecture isn't decoration, it's argument. Those barrel vaults and coffered ceilings represent the heights of human reason, the permanent structures we build to house temporary thoughts. Watch how the figures occupy that space. No two have identical poses. Some lean, some stand, some sit, some cluster in animated discussion, while others stand apart, lost in private thought. The distribution isn't random. Your eye travels through the composition in a deliberate path, from the foreground groups to the central figures of Plato and Aristotle, then deeper into the architectural space where more philosophers continue their debates. It's choreography. Every figure is positioned to lead you somewhere else, to keep you moving through the painting without feeling manipulated. The colour tells its own story. Raffaello understood something about human perception that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries. Warm colours advance, cool colours recede. In the School of Athens, the foreground figures wear rich reds and oranges. As your eye moves deeper into the space, the colours cool to blues and greys. It's subtle enough that you don't consciously notice, but it reinforces the illusion of depth the painting breathes. Now look at the Sistine Madonna, completed around 1513. On first glance, it appears simple. Mary holding the infant Christ, flanked by Saint Sixtus and Saint Barbara, with two cherubs propped on the ledge below. Standard iconography. Nothing revolutionary, except everything is revolutionary. Start with Mary's face. She's young, but her eyes are ancient. She knows what's coming. The Christ child she holds will be crucified. This isn't spelled out with obvious symbols. It's there in the tension around her mouth, in the way she holds the baby, both protectively and as an offering. She's simultaneously mother and participant in a divine plan she didn't choose. That contradiction exists in her expression without being resolved. The cherubs below have been reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to dorm room posters, usually ripped from their context and treated as cute decoration. This is a profound misunderstanding. Within the painting, they're not decoration at all. They're witnesses. They rest their chins on the ledge and stare upward with knowing boredom. They've seen this scene before, will see it again, understand its cosmic implications in a way humans can't. Their presence turns the painting from a simple, devotional image into something stranger, a moment when the eternal intersects with the temporal, and even the angels are tired. The composition itself challenges everything that came before. Renaissance painting had developed rules: balance, symmetry, stable geometric arrangements. Raffaello breaks them all. Mary and the Christ child are off-centre, slightly too high in the frame. The curtains pull back asymmetrically. Saint Sixtus gestures outward, acknowledging the viewer's presence, while Saint Barbara looks down and away. Nothing settles. The painting creates a dynamic instability that keeps you looking, trying to find the resolution that never comes. This is the paradox of Raffaello's work. It appears serene on the surface but contains irresolvable tensions underneath. Heaven and earth, divine plan and human suffering, perfect form and inevitable death. He doesn't hide these contradictions. He makes them visible while maintaining an impossible grace. The portrait of Julius II demonstrates something else entirely. How do you paint power? Previous papal portraits showed authority through symbols. The tiara, the throne, the elaborate vestments. These things appear in Raffaello's portrait too, but they're not what you notice. You notice the old man's face, worn down by the weight of trying to restore the church's temporal power. You notice his hands, veined and spotted, gripping the chair arms with a tension that suggests he's barely holding on. You notice that he's not looking at you. He's looking past you, into a distance where his ambitions have already failed. This is a portrait of defeat disguised as authority. Julius had hired Raffaello to glorify his reign. What he got was the truth. The painting was so psychologically acute that when Julius died and it was hung in Santa Maria del Popolo, People reportedly knelt before it, thinking it was the Pope himself sitting there. They were worshipping an image that revealed weakness even as it claimed power. The technique here is different from the smooth perfection of the Madonnas. You can see the brushwork. The surface has texture. The colours are muted, almost drab. This isn't failure or haste. It's a deliberate choice to match technique to subject. An old man doesn't deserve the idealised treatment of the Virgin Mary. He deserves to be seen as he is. What made Raffaello dangerous to every artist who came after was this versatility. He could paint like Perugino when the subject demanded grace. He could paint like Leonardo when it demanded subtlety. He could paint like Michelangelo when it demanded power. But he was also entirely himself, synthesizing these influences into something that transcended any single approach. How do you compete with someone who can do everything? The answer for 3 centuries was that you don't. You study Raffaello, you copy Raffaello, you try to understand the principles underlying his work and apply them to your own. The French Academy, founded in 1648, made this systematic. Students drew from plaster casts of ancient sculptures and from engravings of Raffaello's paintings. They analysed his compositions mathematically. They measured the proportions of his figures. They tried to extract rules that could be taught and learned. This killed him more effectively than any rival could have. By turning Raffaello into a system, into academic doctrine, the academies transformed living painting into dead formula. Students learned to arrange figures according to Raffaello's patterns without understanding why those patterns worked. They copied his smooth finish without grasping that the smoothness served the image's meaning. They pursued his grace and achieved only prettiness. By the time Delacroix and the Romantics rebelled in the early 19th century, Raffaello had become everything they hated: rules, convention, the dead hand of the past preventing innovation. The pre-Raphaelites went further, arguing that art had taken a wrong turn with Raffaello, that his very perfection had been a mistake. They wanted to return to the supposedly more authentic, more spiritual art of the medieval and early Renaissance periods. This is deeply ironic because Raffaello himself was trying to escape convention. Every painting was an attempt to solve new problems, to synthesize more completely, to push further. The School of Athens wasn't following rules. It was inventing them. The Sistine Madonna wasn't conventional piety. It was a radical reimagining of how divine presence could be represented. Julius II's portrait wasn't flattery. It was psychological excavation. But once an artist becomes synonymous with perfection, his actual achievements become invisible. People see the reputation instead of the work. They see Raffaello, the abstract ideal, instead of Raffaello, the human being who struggled with impossible commissions, who was exhausted by demands he couldn't refuse, who died believing his greatest painting was unfinished. The Transfiguration remains his most complex work. The bottom half shows the apostles failing to heal a possessed boy. They gesture frantically, their faces showing confusion and distress. The father holds his son, desperate, while the disciples argue among themselves about what to do. It's chaos rendered with a dramatic intensity that Raffaello had never attempted before. The figures twist and gesture, the composition's fragments into competing focal points. Nothing is resolved. The top half shows Christ transfigured on Mount Tabor, floating above the earth, flanked by Moses and Elijah. Below him, Peter, James, and John shield their eyes from the divine light. This section is calmer, more controlled, closer to Raffaello's earlier style. But even here, there's tension. Christ is suspended between heaven and earth, neither fully ascending nor descending. The prophets attend him but seem uncertain. The disciples cower rather than rejoice. The painting doesn't resolve the relationship between these two halves. Heaven and earth occupy the same frame, but don't touch. Christ's power is visible above, but unavailable below. The faithful struggle while the divine remains distant. This wasn't what Narbonne Cathedral had commissioned. They wanted a straightforward transfiguration, a glorious moment of divine revelation. What they got was a question without an answer. Raffaello worked on this painting for 4 years, repeatedly revising, never satisfied. The lower section particularly troubled him. He painted and repainted the possessed boy's face, trying to capture the specific quality of divine suffering versus demonic possession versus ordinary human pain. He rearranged the apostles' positions dozens of times, seeking a composition that would show their failure without making them look merely incompetent. He adjusted Christ's position in the upper section, trying to find the exact point between ascension and presence. The painting was unfinished when he died. His assistants completed sections he'd left in underpainting. The exact boundaries of what Raffaello painted versus what his workshop added are still debated, but the conception was entirely his, and that conception was darker and more psychologically complex than anything in his earlier work. If he'd lived, would his style have continued in this direction? Would the serene grace that made him famous have given way to something more turbulent, more uncertain? We can't know. What we have is a career that ended at its moment of greatest ambition, with the artist reaching towards something new and dying before he could grasp it. The house where Raffaello died became a pilgrimage site almost immediately. Artists came to sketch the rooms where he'd worked. They examined his unfinished paintings, trying to understand his methods. They collected anecdotes from people who'd known him. The myth-making began before his body was cold, but underneath the myth was a stranger truth. Raffaello wasn't a serene genius, effortlessly producing masterpieces. He was a man who worked himself to death, trying to satisfy impossible demands while pushing his art towards something that existed only in his imagination. The perfection everyone sees in his paintings wasn't natural. It was fought for, paid for, with exhaustion and compromise, and finally with his life. The funeral procession wound through Rome on April 8, 1520. Cardinals walked alongside ordinary painters. Nobles followed behind apprentices. The entire artistic community of Rome turned out to honour a man who'd been dead for 2 days. They carried Raffaello's body to the Pantheon, that ancient Roman temple converted to a Christian church. He'd requested burial there, and the Pope had granted permission. It was an extraordinary honour. The Pantheon held the remains of kings. Now it would hold a painter. Inside that circular space with its great dome open to the sky, they placed him in a niche carved into the wall. Above the tomb, they installed the transfiguration, still unfinished, still asking its unanswered question. The juxtaposition was almost too perfect. The painting showed divine power suspended above human suffering. The tomb held a man who tried to bridge that gap through art. His workshop dissolved immediately. Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Penny tried to maintain the studio, but commissions dried up. Clients wanted Raffaello, not his assistants. Within a year, both men had left Rome. Romano went to Mantua. Penny scattered to various cities. The machine that had produced so much in such a short time simply stopped. The unfinished projects were distributed according to contracts and papal decree. Some were completed by other artists, some were abandoned. The Villa Farnesina frescoes remained incomplete. The Vatican loggia was finished by Romano, working from Raffaello's designs, but everyone could see where the master's hand stopped and the copyists began. Maria Bibbiena never spoke publicly about Raffaello's death. She withdrew from court life. Within months, she entered a convent. The betrothal that had hung over them both for 8 years ended with his death. She took vows and disappeared from history. We don't know if she mourned him or felt released. The records say nothing. Fornarina, the baker's daughter, received a bequest in Raffaello's will. Not enough to live on for long, but something. She used the money to enter a convent in Trastevere. Whether this was piety or pragmatism, we cannot say. A mistress without a patron had few options. The convent at least offered security. The myth began its work almost immediately. Within weeks, writers were comparing Raffaello to the ancient masters, suggesting that the gods themselves had called him back because they were jealous of his talent. The Biography by Vasari, published 30 years later, created the version of Raffaello that would dominate for centuries. The perfect artist, the divine genius, the man who never struggled because everything came naturally to him. This wasn't true, but it was useful. The Catholic Church, reeling from the Protestant Reformation, needed examples of how Christian culture could produce sublime beauty. Raffaello became that example. His Madonnas were reproduced in thousands of prints and copies. His style was taught in academies as the correct way to paint. His compositions were analysed as models of harmony and grace. The real man disappeared beneath this construction. The ambitious networker became a serene genius. The exhausted, overworked businessman became an effortless creator. The artist who died trying to push beyond his own limits became a symbol of achieved perfection. Let's examine what actually survived of his work. The numbers are remarkable. In a career of roughly 20 years, Raffaello produced or supervised hundreds of works. The Vatican rooms alone contain thousands of square feet of frescoes. Add the private commissions, the altarpieces, the portraits, the architectural designs, the archaeological surveys, and you have an output that seems impossible for one lifetime. But here's the complication. How much of this was actually painted by Raffaello's hand? The workshop system makes attribution a nightmare. A painting might be designed by the master, underdrawn by assistants, partially executed by Raffaello, completed by the workshop, and signed with his name. Which parts count as his? Where does collaboration end and forgery begin? Modern scholarship has been picking apart these attributions for over a century. X-rays reveal underdrawings. Chemical analysis dates pigments. Stylistic analysis compares brushwork. The result is a much smaller core of works that everyone agrees came entirely from Raffaello's hand. Maybe 50 paintings, maybe fewer. Does this diminish his achievement? Not really. The workshop was his invention too. The system he created for producing art at scale was as innovative as any individual painting. He understood that art was becoming a business, that demand was outstripping what any single painter could produce, that organization and delegation were necessary for survival. The frescoes in the Vatican demonstrate this clearly. The first room, the Stanza della Segnatura, shows his personal style throughout. He painted most of it himself. The second room, the Stanza dell'Odoro, shows increasing workshop participation. By the third room, the Stanza dell'Incendio, scholars estimate that Raffaello painted only the most important figures, leaving vast sections to assistants working from his designs. This wasn't laziness or decline, it was adaptation to impossible demands. Pope Julius wanted 4 rooms decorated in a time frame that would have required Michelangelo and Leonardo combined. Raffaello found a way to deliver what the patron wanted while maintaining enough personal involvement to preserve quality control. The portraits, by contrast, seemed to be almost entirely from his hand. These were smaller, more intimate commissions where the client expected to interact with the master personally. The portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, painted around 1515, shows no sign of workshop intervention. Every brushstroke feels deliberate and personal. Castiglione stares out from the painting with an expression that's hard to read. He's not quite smiling. His eyes are intelligent but guarded. He wears black and grey, colours of dignity rather than display. The painting is a study in restraint, in the kind of cultivated self-control that Castiglione's own book, The Courtier, would recommend as essential for success in Renaissance society. Raffaello painted his friend as both an individual and an ideal. This is what a perfect courtier looks like. Educated but not ostentatious, confident but not arrogant, present but not aggressive. The painting became a template for aristocratic portraiture for the next 3 centuries. When you see a formal portrait of a European noble, you're seeing Castiglione's influence filtered through Raffaello's vision. The architectural projects are even harder to assess. Raffaello was appointed architect of St. Peter's Basilica in 1514, taking over from Bramante after the older architect's death. He proposed significant changes to Bramante's design, shifting from a pure Greek cross plan to something more complex and, he argued, more functional. We have his drawings, we have written descriptions of his intentions, we have fragments of foundation work that may or may not reflect his plans. What we don't have is the building he envisioned. The design was abandoned after his death. The basilica eventually built by Michelangelo and others bears no resemblance to what Raffaello proposed. Same with his archaeological work. Pope Leo commissioned him to create a comprehensive survey of ancient Rome, documenting every surviving structure and creating a map of the city as it had been at the height of the empire. Raffaello spent years on this project, employing surveyors and scholars, developing new techniques for measuring and recording ruins. The work was never finished. The maps and drawings were scattered after his death. Some survive in various collections, most are lost. The systematic archaeological survey he pioneered wouldn't be attempted again for centuries. We can only glimpse what he was trying to accomplish through fragments and second-hand accounts. This pattern repeats across his career. Ambitious projects begun, partially completed, abandoned or finished by others. The common thread is scale. Raffaello was always trying to do more than one person could reasonably accomplish. The workshop system was his solution, but it was never quite enough. There were always more commissions than hours in the day. His influence on subsequent art is impossible to overstate. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1520 to 1820, being a painter meant studying Raffaello. The academies that trained artists across Europe used his compositions as teaching tools. Students copied his figures to learn proportion. They analysed his colour harmonies. They memorised his solutions to compositional problems. This created a tradition, but also a trap. By the 19th century, younger artists felt suffocated by Raffaello's example. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in England took their name from a deliberate rejection of his influence. They wanted to return to the art before Raffaello, before what they saw as his perfection calcifying into dead academic formulas. The Impressionists largely ignored him. They were interested in light and perception, not idealized form and balanced composition. Raffaello's carefully controlled spaces meant nothing to painters who wanted to capture the chaos of modern life. The 20th century was even harsher. Modernism valued rawness, psychological depth, formal experimentation. Raffaello's harmonious perfection seemed irrelevant at best, dishonest at worst. How could you paint serene Madonnas after 2 world wars? How could you believe in ideal beauty after the Holocaust? For much of the last century, Raffaello's reputation declined. He was respected as a historical figure, but not loved as a living influence. Museums still displayed his paintings, but artists didn't study them. Scholars wrote about him, but the general public found him boring. Too perfect, too remote, too Renaissance. Something has shifted in recent decades. Maybe it's postmodernism's willingness to reconsider everything. Maybe it's digital reproduction, making his work more accessible. Maybe it's simple historical distance. But Raffaello is being reconsidered, not as a symbol of dead academic tradition, but as a working artist who faced impossible demands and found innovative solutions. The workshop system looks less like cheating and more like modern studio practice. His ability to manage large teams while maintaining artistic vision resonates with contemporary, collaborative art. His struggle to balance personal expression with client demands feels familiar to anyone working in creative industries today. The paintings themselves hold up remarkably well. The School of Athens still works as a composition. The Madonnas still convey something beyond mere technical skill. The portraits still capture individual personalities. The Vatican frescoes still fill their spaces with authority and grace. Stand in front of the Sistine Madonna today, and you can still feel what viewers felt 500 years ago. There's a directness to the image that survives changes in taste and theory. Mary steps toward us holding her child. Cherubs lean on a ledge below, bored with heaven. The curtains part. The vision appears. It's theatrical, but the theatre works. Or look at the portrait of Leo X with Cardinals Giulio de' Medici and Luigi de' Rossi. The Pope sits at a table examining an illuminated manuscript. His face is fleshed, intelligent, calculating. He's not idealized. This is a specific man in a specific moment, caught in the act of aesthetic judgment. The cardinals attend him, one deferential, one watchful. The whole painting is about power relationships made visible through posture and glance. These works aren't perfect in the sense of being flawless. They're perfect in the sense of being completely achieved. They do exactly what they set out to do. The vision and the execution match. Intention and result align. That's rare. Most artists spend their careers chasing a vision they can never quite capture. The gap between what they imagine and what they can produce torments them. Raffaello, at least in his mature work, closed that gap. He could see something in his mind and then make it exist in the world. This is what made him invaluable to patrons and exhausting to himself. Once they knew he could deliver exactly what they wanted everything. And he couldn't say no. The commissions kept coming. The deadlines kept pressing. The workshop kept expanding until his body gave out at 37. The death certificate lists acute fever. Modern doctors suspect pneumonia, possibly malaria, maybe typhoid. Some historians whisper poison, though there's no real evidence. What matters is the speed. He fell ill on Good Friday, 1520, after supervising excavations at a Roman villa. Within a week he was dead. He was conscious enough to make a will. He left money for his mistress, though she's not named in the document. He requested burial in the Pantheon, that ancient Roman temple converted to a church, the building whose perfect geometry had inspired so much of his work. He received last rites. Cardinals visited, students wept. On April 6, 1520, Raffaello Sanzio died in the same city where he'd achieved everything. Giorgio Vasari, writing 20 years later, claimed that all of Rome mourned. The funeral procession stretched through the streets. The unfinished transfiguration was displayed at the head of his bier, a reminder of what would never be completed. They buried him in the Pantheon, as he'd requested, in a chapel he'd designed himself for Cardinal Bibbiena. The inscription on his tomb, composed by Pietro Bembo, reads, "Here lies Raffaello, by whom nature feared to be conquered while he lived, and when he was dying, feared herself to die." It's the kind of epitaph that sounds ridiculous until you consider what it means. Nature itself, intimidated by human achievement. The natural order threatened by one man's ability to capture and perfect it. Hyperbole, yes, but hyperbole pointing at something real. What did he leave behind? First, the obvious things. Hundreds of paintings, though many completed by his workshop. Thousands of drawings, preparatory studies that show his working method. Architectural designs, including plans for St. Peter's that would influence its final form, even though he didn't live to execute them. Tapestry designs, prints, decorative schemes. A massive body of work for 37 years. But the real legacy is harder to quantify. He left a standard. For 3 centuries after his death, if you wanted to know what painting could be at its highest level, you looked at Raffaello, not for innovation or emotional intensity or disturbing vision, but for sheer accomplished perfection. The thing done completely right. This became a burden. By the 19th century, artists were rebelling against exactly the qualities Raffaello represented. The pre-Raphaelites, despite their name, actually admired early Raffaello, the Perugino-influenced work before he came fully into his powers. They thought the mature style was too polished, too perfect, too dead. John Ruskin, the influential critic, dismissed the Vatican frescoes as worthless. He preferred the honesty and awkwardness of medieval art to Raffaello's smooth mastery. The Impressionists ignored him completely. The Expressionists found him irrelevant. The Cubists were solving problems he'd never imagined. Modernism had no use for an artist whose whole project was making difficult things look effortless. They wanted the struggle visible. They wanted process showing through product. They wanted anxiety, fragmentation, the breakdown of coherent space and form, which meant that for most of the 20th century, if you admired Raffaello, you were automatically suspect, conservative, academic, nostalgic for dead certainties, the kind of person who thought art peaked in 1520 and it's been downhill ever since. Nobody wanted to be that person. What's strange is that Raffaello himself would probably have understood the rebellion. He'd rebelled too, against Perugino's formulas, against the constraints of Florentine style, against Michelangelo's intimidating example. He'd constantly pushed towards something new within the boundaries of what patrons would accept. The difference is that his rebellion was quiet. He didn't theorize or proclaim. He just painted differently. Look at the late portraits. The woman with the veil, known as La Fornerina, possibly his mistress, probably Maria Bibbiena. She looks directly out at us. One breast is bare. Her expression is knowing, amused, slightly challenging. This isn't a Madonna. This isn't an allegory. This is a specific woman who knows exactly what she means to the painter. There's an intimacy here that has nothing to do with idealization, or the portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, the author of the Book of the Courtier, that handbook of Renaissance behaviour. Castiglione sits in elegant grey and black clothing. His face is intelligent, thoughtful, slightly melancholy. He's not performing for us. He's just present. The painting feels like a conversation between friends, one that's comfortable with silence. These works show another Raffaello, one less concerned with perfection and more interested in capturing the complicated reality of individual people. If he'd lived longer, this might have become his dominant mode. The ideal beauty might have given way to something more nuanced and strange. We'll never know. The workshop he left behind fractured immediately. Giulio Romano and Gianfrancesco Penny tried to continue, finishing commissions, taking on new projects. But without Raffaello's unifying vision and diplomatic skill, the operation couldn't sustain itself. Within a few years, the assistants had scattered to different cities, carrying Raffaello's methods with them, but unable to recreate his achievements. Giulio Romano went to Mantua and became the leading artist there, developing a highly personal style that pushed Raffaello's classical language towards something more theatrical and strange. His Palazzo Te frescoes show what happens when you take Raffaello's vocabulary and twist it, making architectural elements seem to collapse, creating spaces that feel unstable and dreamlike. It's brilliant work, but it's not what Raffaello would have done. The restraint is gone. The students in the workshop when he died must have felt abandoned. They'd been trained in a specific method, taught to work in a specific style, prepared for careers that depended on Raffaello's continuing success. Suddenly he was gone, and they had to figure out how to function without him. Some succeeded, most didn't. Their names are footnotes in art history, known mainly for having worked in his studio. The architectural projects were left incomplete. Antonio da San Gallo the Younger took over St. Peter's, then Michelangelo, then others. The building that finally rose bore traces of Raffaello's ideas but wasn't his building. The Villa Madama was never finished. The palace designs were modified or abandoned. Bramante's architecture had continuation through Raffaello. Raffaello's architecture ended with him. What survived most completely were the paintings. They couldn't be modified or completed by others in the same way. They existed as finished objects, and they were immediately recognized as masterpieces. Within decades, prints and copies were circulating throughout Europe. Artists made pilgrimages to Rome specifically to study the Vatican frescoes. The stanza became a required stop on the Grand Tour. If you wanted to be educated, you had to see Raffaello. This is where the problem started. The work became too famous. It became the example that students copied, the standard that academies enforced, the model that everyone was supposed to emulate. Academic art education, for centuries, meant learning to draw like Raffaello, to compose like Raffaello, to achieve that same smooth perfection of form, which meant that generations of artists learned technique, but not vision. They could copy the surface, but couldn't access the thinking underneath. The 19th century Academy paintings that now gather dust in museum storage are full of Raphaelesque Madonnas, Raphaelesque compositions, Raphaelesque attempts at ideal beauty. They're technically accomplished and completely dead. The painters learned the vocabulary but had nothing to say with it. They mistook means for ends, thinking that if they could achieve the same smooth modelling and graceful poses, they'd achieved art. They hadn't. They'd achieved craft in service of nothing. This wasn't Raffaello's fault. He never claimed to have discovered eternal laws. He was solving specific problems, for specific patrons, in specific contexts. The academic system that came after took his solutions and fossilized them into rules. Don't compose this way. Do model this way. Achieve this type of finish. The spontaneity and intelligence visible in his drawings got lost in the official version of what he represented. When modernism rejected all that, they were rejecting the academic version, not necessarily Raffaello himself, but he got caught in the blast. You couldn't say you admired Raffaello without seeming to endorse everything the Academy represented. So for most of the 20th century, serious artists didn't talk about him. He became the example of everything that needed to be overthrown. Only recently has it become possible to look at him fresh, to see the working artist rather than the academic icon, to notice the intelligence in how he solved compositional problems, the psychological insight in the portraits, the sheer organizational genius of the Vatican frescoes, to recognize that someone can be technically perfect and still be interesting. Part of this reassessment comes from understanding the work differently. We're not looking for emotional authenticity or radical innovation anymore. We're interested in how things are made, how artistic production functions, how someone manages to coordinate complex projects while maintaining quality. These are contemporary concerns, and Raffaello was extraordinarily good at exactly these things. His workshop model looks less like cheating and more like a prototype for modern creative studios. Film directors don't paint every frame. Architects don't draft every line. Fashion designers don't sew every garment. They have vision and control the process while delegating execution. That's what Raffaello did. He designed, he supervised, he corrected. The workshop produced. It's a model that makes sense to us now in ways it didn't to previous generations. The paintings also benefit from being seen in reproduction. This sounds backwards, since everyone knows you should see art in person. But Raffaello's work, especially the large frescoes, is actually hard to see properly in situ. The stands are crowded. The light is difficult. You can't get the right distance. A good photograph can sometimes show the compositional intelligence more clearly than standing in the actual room. The work translates well to other media because it was always about design as much as execution. Digital humanities tools have revealed aspects of his working method that weren't previously visible. Infrared imaging shows underdrawings, changes of mind, pentimenti. We can see him thinking through problems, trying different arrangements, adjusting as he went. The finished surface that looks so inevitable turns out to have been achieved through constant revision. The perfection was hard-won, not spontaneous. This makes him more interesting. The man who could draw anything effortlessly is less compelling than the man who worked and reworked until he got it right. The evidence of labour, normally hidden beneath the polished surface, becomes visible through technology. We can see the artist thinking, which is always more interesting than simply seeing the result. None of this changes the fact that he died too young. 37 is no age. He should have had another 30 years. He might have developed in completely unexpected directions. The late portrait suggests someone moving toward a more introspective, less public style, or he might have continued producing papal commissions until he burned out completely. We can't know. What we can say is that he accomplished more in 37 years than most artists manage in twice that time. He transformed how space was organized in paintings. He established standards for beauty that lasted centuries. He showed that supreme technical skill and genuine feeling weren't incompatible. He proved that perfection was achievable, at least sometimes, at least briefly. The question isn't whether he's the greatest painter who ever lived. That question is unanswerable and not very interesting. The question is what he achieved and how he achieved it. And the answer is that he looked at the problems of his moment and solved them with such complete success that his solutions became invisible, became simply how things were done, became so natural that they seemed inevitable. That's the deepest success any artist can have, not to be recognized as innovative or revolutionary, but to be so thoroughly absorbed into the visual language that people forget you invented it. The workshop system raises a final question that's worth considering. How much of what we call Raphael's art is actually Raphael? The answer depends entirely on what we mean by the question. If we mean the physical application of paint, then large portions of his later work weren't done by his hand. If we mean the intellectual conception, the design, the compositional intelligence, then everything is his. The workshop was an extension of his mind and eye. The assistants executed his vision. They didn't contribute their own. This is how art production worked for most of history. The idea of the solitary artist creating everything personally is a romantic invention that would have seemed bizarre to Raphael's contemporaries. They understood that large projects required teams. What mattered was control, not manual labour. But there's another way to think about authorship that complicates this tidy arrangement. When Giulio Romano painted a section of the fire in the Borgo, he brought his own sensibility to the work. His temperament was different from Raphael's, more dramatic, more interested in unusual poses and extreme emotions. You can feel this in certain passages. The workshop product wasn't entirely neutral. It bore traces of the personalities involved. Raphael managed this by maintaining strict oversight. He would correct anything that deviated from his intentions. But the final work was collaborative in ways that go beyond simple execution. The assistants weren't photocopiers, they interpreted. This makes attribution studies both important and frustrating. Scholars spend enormous effort trying to determine which hand painted which section. It's detective work using style analysis, technical examination, documentary evidence. Sometimes the conclusions are solid, often they're speculative, and even when we're confident about who did what, the question remains whether it matters. If Raphael designed it, approved it, and signed his name to it, is it his work? Most scholars now say yes with caveats. The caveats are the interesting part. What we're really asking is how much physical touch matters in art. For a sculptor, it matters enormously. Michelangelo's hand on marble creates effects that can't be delegated. The subtle variations in surface texture, the way he'd finish one area highly and leave another rough, these were personal choices made in the moment of carving. Painting is different. Once the design is established, execution can be standardized more easily. Not entirely, but more than sculpture. This is why Raphael could run a workshop, and Michelangelo mostly couldn't. The business side of the workshop also bears examination. Raphael was operating what we'd now call a creative agency. He took commissions, assessed scope and budget, allocated resources, managed timelines, dealt with difficult clients. The famous letter to Castiglione about the Galatea shows him negotiating expectations and explaining his methods. He was a professional in the modern sense, not a bohemian genius waiting for inspiration. This professionalism is part of why he succeeded. He delivered on time and on budget. Clients knew they'd get quality work without drama. That's valuable. It's not romantic, but it's how large projects actually get completed. The financial records that survive show he was wealthy by the standards of his time. Not Medici wealthy, but comfortable. He owned property, employed servants, lived well. The workshop generated substantial income. This wasn't exploitation. Assistants were paid and gained valuable training. Many went on to successful independent careers. The system worked for everyone involved. Raphael got to take on more commissions than he could handle alone. Assistants learned from a master and built their reputations. Clients received work that met their needs. It was a functional economic arrangement, not a mystical communion of artistic souls. This economic reality has bothered some critics who prefer to imagine artists above such mundane concerns. But there's no evidence Raphael was conflicted about making money. He seems to have enjoyed success and the lifestyle it enabled. The idea that true artists must suffer in poverty is another romantic notion that would have puzzled Renaissance professionals. They were craftsmen producing goods for clients. Getting well paid was a sign of quality work, not corruption. The influence of his methods extended beyond painting. He designed tapestries, architecture, decorative programs for entire rooms. He thought in terms of total environments, not isolated objects. The stanza work this way. Each room has a unified theme expressed through multiple elements. The architecture, the painting, the sculpture, the floor patterns, everything contributes. This holistic approach influenced how subsequent artists thought about large-scale projects. It established the concept of the artist as designer-in-chief, orchestrating multiple crafts toward a unified vision. His architectural work is often undervalued. He wasn't the innovator Bramante was, or the genius Michelangelo would become, but he understood classical principles thoroughly and applied them intelligently. The Palazzo Branconio dell'Aquila, now destroyed, showed sophisticated handling of facades and proportions. His designs for St. Peter's, developed after Bramante's death, attempted to reconcile competing demands of the commission. The work was competent and thoughtful, not revolutionary, but solid. This is typical of Raphael. He wasn't trying to reinvent architecture. He was trying to do it well. The archaeological work he undertook for Pope Leo deserves mention. He was appointed to oversee the preservation of ancient monuments in Rome. This was an early example of heritage conservation, centuries before the concept became formalized. Raphael took it seriously. He documented ruins, prevented further destruction, argued for the importance of preserving the past. The appointment shows he was respected beyond his painting. He was seen as someone who understood the larger cultural project of the Renaissance, not just an executant of commissions. His death came suddenly. The exact cause remains disputed. Contemporary accounts mention fever, possibly malaria. Some sources suggest overindulgence, though these are probably unreliable. What's clear is that he fell ill in early April 1520 and died within days. He was working until close to the end. The transfiguration was completed by assistants after his death using his designs. The funeral was enormous. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Here lies Raphael, by whom nature feared to be outdone while he lived, and when he died, feared that she herself would die." It's hyperbolic, but contemporaries believed it. The immediate aftermath saw his workshop dissolve. Giulio Romano took over some projects. Other assistants scattered. The system Raphael had built couldn't survive without him at the center. This isn't surprising. Highly personalized organizations rarely outlast their founders. What did survive was the influence, which was enormous and immediate. Every painter in Rome for the next century worked in his shadow. The Mannerists who came next either extended his principles or rebelled against them, but they couldn't ignore him. Parmigianino took the elegance to extremes. Pontormo complicated the clarity. but both were responding to what Raphael had established. Even artists who rejected his approach defined themselves against it. You can't escape a standard by pretending it doesn't exist. You have to acknowledge it, even in opposition. The Caracci in Bologna, a century later, made returning to Raphael their explicit program. They saw him as the exemplar of classical balance between naturalism and idealization. Their academy taught students to study his work as the foundation of good painting. This pedagogical influence lasted through the next 2 centuries. Art schools across Europe used his compositions as teaching tools. Students copied his drawings. They studied his prints. The reproductive engravings of Marcantonio Raimondi, made during Raphael's lifetime, spread his designs across Europe. This was early mass media, and it made his influence nearly universal. The academic tradition that dominated European art until the 19th century was essentially Raphaelesque. The emphasis on drawing, on clear composition, on noble subjects treated with dignity, all this came from his example. When the Impressionists and later Modernists rebelled against academic art, they were still, in a sense, rebelling against Raphael. His influence was so thorough that rejecting it meant rejecting much of what had been considered good art for 3 centuries. This is the fate of hugely successful artists. They become the thing that must be overcome. But something curious happened in the late 20th century. As modernism's dominance faded and art history became more sophisticated, Raphael began to be reassessed not as the enemy, but as a complex figure worth understanding on his own terms. He'd shown that supreme beauty could be achieved through discipline and intelligence, that classical principles could be learned and applied, that the highest art combined thought and feeling in proportions so balanced the viewer never noticed the effort required. This seemed like wisdom worth preserving. But by the 19th century, artists started questioning whether perfection might actually be a trap, whether the smoothness of his surfaces hid something important, whether the balance of his compositions prevented certain truths from being expressed, whether making difficult things look effortless was actually dishonest about how difficult things are. The pre-Raphaelites named themselves in opposition to him. They wanted the awkwardness and honesty of medieval art. They thought something vital had been lost when Raffaello showed how to make everything graceful. The Impressionists ignored him completely. The Modernists found him irrelevant. For much of the 20th century, admiring Raffaello meant you were conservative, nostalgic, afraid of the new. This was unfair. He wasn't trying to prevent future art. He was solving the problems of his moment. The fact that his solutions worked so well they became orthodoxy isn't his fault. He didn't claim to have discovered eternal laws. He just painted better than anyone else. That the academies turned his methods into rigid formulas was their mistake, not his. What's emerging now is a more complicated picture. We can see him as both extraordinary and limited, someone who achieved something genuine within the boundaries of what his culture valued, who mastered the visual language of his time so completely he defined it for centuries, but who also, perhaps inevitably, couldn't see beyond those boundaries, couldn't imagine that other kinds of perfection might be possible, other ways of organizing space and representing experience. His influence isn't just historical, it's built into how we see. The compositional principles he perfected, the ways he organized figures in space, the techniques he developed for suggesting depth and volume, all of this is still how images are made. Film composition uses his principles. Photography relies on his understanding of how the eye moves through space. Graphic design applies his sense of balance and hierarchy. Even people who've never heard his name are seeing through frameworks he established. This is the deepest kind of success, not to be remembered as revolutionary, but to be so thoroughly absorbed that you become invisible. To solve problems so completely that people forget they were ever problems. To establish standards that feel natural rather than invented. The man himself remains elusive. We have the paintings and the buildings and the drawings. We have contracts and letters dealing with business. We have second-hand accounts from people who knew him. But we don't have his inner life. We don't know what he actually thought about his work, about his moment, about the demands placed on him. We don't know if he was satisfied or frustrated or some combination that changed daily. What we have is the work. And the work suggests someone who believed deeply in harmony, in resolution, in the possibility of achieving perfection through intelligence and effort. Someone who thought the world could be understood and represented accurately. Someone who never questioned whether these goals were worth pursuing. This faith is foreign to us now. We don't believe in perfection. We're suspicious of harmony. We value disruption and difficulty and the visible evidence of struggle. Raffaello's smoothness looks like evasion. His balance looks like avoidance. His grace looks like a refusal to acknowledge how messy and complicated existence actually is. But maybe that's our limitation, not his. Maybe the ability to create order and beauty, despite knowing how temporary and fragile they are, is actually harder than showing chaos. Maybe grace under pressure is more difficult than expressing pressure directly. Maybe solving problems is as valuable as exposing them. He died believing he'd failed. The transfiguration wasn't finished. The architectural projects weren't complete. The workshop was producing work faster than he could properly supervise it. There was always more to do, always another commission, always another patron wanting something only he could provide. He was exhausted. The fever came. A week later, he was gone. But he hadn't failed. He'd achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. He'd shown that supreme technical mastery and genuine feeling weren't incompatible. He'd proven that beauty could be consciously constructed without losing its power. He'd established standards that lasted longer than empires. Not bad for 37 years. The Pantheon where he's buried has survived everything. Barbarian invasions, the collapse of Rome, medieval neglect, Renaissance renovation. The building he admired for its perfect geometry still stands, its great dome open to the sky, its circular space still demonstrating how architecture can capture cosmic order. His tomb sits in a niche in the wall. Above it, for centuries, hung the Transfiguration. Now the painting is elsewhere, but the inscription remains. Here lies Raffaello, by whom nature feared to be outdone while he lived, and when he died, feared that she herself would die. Nature didn't die. Neither did art. Both continued without him, changing in ways he couldn't have predicted or probably approved, but something did end when he died. A certain confidence about what art could achieve, a belief that perfection was possible and worth pursuing, a faith that intelligence and discipline could solve any visual problem. That confidence hasn't returned. We don't believe in it anymore. We've seen too much. We know too much about what perfection costs and who pays the price. We're suspicious of surfaces that hide the labour required to create them. We want art that shows its wounds, its doubts, its failures. But sometimes standing in front of the School of Athens or the Sistine Madonna or the portrait of Julius II, that old confidence becomes briefly imaginable again. Not as something to return to, that's impossible, but as evidence that human intelligence, properly applied, can create something that outlasts its maker, can establish standards that survive centuries, can solve problems so completely that the solutions become invisible. Raffaello proved that once. Nobody's proven it since. Maybe nobody can. Maybe his moment was unique, allowing a conjunction of talent and opportunity that can't be repeated. Maybe the problems he solved are simply solved, and art had to move on to different questions. Or maybe every generation has to solve the problems of its moment as completely as he solved his. To look at what needs to be done and do it with such thoroughness that future generations forget it was ever difficult. To establish frameworks so solid they become invisible. To create beauty so inevitable it seems natural. That's the standard. Whether it's still relevant is the question. Whether it should be relevant is another question entirely. What remains is the work itself, hanging in galleries and churches, reproduced in books and screens, still showing anyone who looks carefully what one person could achieve in 37 years, when everything came together. The talent, the training, the timing, the luck, all of it aligning just long enough to create something that outlasted its maker by 5 centuries and counting. The starry heavens above and the moral law within. That's what Kant saw. Raffaello saw something different. The starry heavens above and the human capacity to represent them. The moral law within and the possibility of making it visible. He spent his life trying to close the gap between what exists and what could exist, between the world as it is and the world as it might be if we could achieve what we imagine. He didn't close the gap, nobody can, but he got closer than most, close enough that we're still measuring ourselves against what he achieved, still asking whether his kind of perfection matters, still wondering whether grace and intelligence and disciplined effort can create something worth having, still looking at his paintings and seeing not just technical mastery, but a complete vision of how art could function, what it could achieve, what it might mean. The transfiguration remains unfinished, Christ suspended between worlds, the disciples failing below, heaven visible but unreachable. It's the most honest thing he ever painted. The acknowledgement that the gap never closes, that perfection remains always just out of reach, that the best we can do is keep trying, keep working, keep pushing towards something we'll never quite achieve. He kept trying until he couldn't anymore. The fever came, the work stopped, the paintings remain. They're not perfect, despite what 3 centuries of admirers claimed. They're just extraordinarily good. The product of someone who understood what his moment needed and delivered it with authority that still resonates, who solved problems so completely that his solutions became the problems everyone else had to solve, who showed what could be achieved and made it impossible for anyone to pretend it was easy.